Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 4551, the Ransomware Act. Ransomware and cyber attacks by foreign actors are an unfortunate reality of the modern world, and the United States must be prepared as possible to address them. In 2006, Congress passed the Safe Web Act to bolster the Federal Trade Commission's authority to receive information from its foreign counterparts and take investigative action in response. FTC action is critical since the number of consumer complaints against foreign businesses is staggering, with over 255,000 complaints submitted to the FTC's database between 2015 and 2019. The estimated dollar value losses from just these submitted complaints is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. H.R. 4551 amends the Safe Web Act by adding important new FTC reporting requirements. The legislation requires the FTC to provide regular reports to Congress describing cross-border complaints it receives that involve ransomware and other cyber attacks by foreign individuals, companies, and governments with ties to specific countries. This bill also boosts the FTC's role in protecting consumers from ransomware and cyber attacks by helping the FTC and Congress better understand these attacks and how to combat them. It also requires the FTC to submit any legislative recommendations to advance our nation's security against these types of attacks. And this information is crucial in our continued efforts to address this serious issue. Mr. Speaker, protecting Americans and our businesses against cyber attacks from malicious foreign actors is not a partisan issue. And that's why members of the Energy and Commerce Committee unanimously supported this bill and why I strongly support it today. I want to thank Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee Chairman Bill Arakis for his tireless efforts on this legislation and urge everyone to support this important bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this legislation by Representative Bill Arakis, the Ransomware Act. H.R. 4551 amends the U.S. Safe Web Act, a tool the Federal Trade Commission uses to protect consumers with an international dimension, which includes increasing cooperation with foreign law enforcement. This bill quite simply requires the FTC to report on cross-border complaints they receive involving ransomware or other cybersecurity-related incidents committed by our foreign adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I'm sure we all have stories from our districts. For example, a researcher recently located a host in Georgia that could possibly be connected to a Russian host with exploitation tools that are connected to ransomware. With the increase in these attacks, I'm glad to see this legislation under consideration today, which will help Congress, the Federal Trade Commission, and other law enforcement entities better understand these attacks and learn how to better combat them. I urge all my colleagues to vote in favor, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, is recognized.
I have no additional speakers.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentlelady from Washington, Representative McMorris Rogers.
The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 4551, the Ransomware Act. Every sector of our economy can be targeted by bad actors seeking to exploit vulnerabilities in software and networks. Last year, we saw a significant increase in ransomware attacks from groups operating out of and affiliated with foreign countries like China and Russia. This legislation builds on my Safe Web Extension Act, which was enacted last Congress, and amends it to include ransomware in its international reporting and cooperation. This will help protect Americans from ransomware and other cyber attacks from foreign actors. Just a few months ago, the U.S. learned that hackers for the Chinese Communist Party had breached major telecommunications companies and network service providers to steal credentials and harvest data. What the CCP will do with this information, no one knows. If their intent is ransom or to use it to extort Americans, this bill will help us better understand and combat these attacks. We will achieve this by requiring the FTC to report on cross-border complaints involving ransomware or other cybersecurity-related incidences committed by foreign adversaries. This will help safeguard critical industries from countries like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and others that may wish to harm us. So I want to thank the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee leader, Gus Bilirakis, for his work on H.R. 4151, 4551, and I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey continues to reserve. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield as much time as she shall consume to the gentlelady from Iowa, Representative.
The gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Carter, for yielding me time. I rise in support of H.R. 4551, the Ransomware Act. This important legislation will help protect consumers and businesses from ransomware and cyber attacks. Almost every day, there are reports of foreign bad actors using ransomware to attack companies, hospital systems, law enforcement agencies, school, and municipalities. Last year, the largest meat processing company in the world, JBS, who has a meat processing plant in my district, was hacked by a Russian-led cybercriminal organization. These hackers threatened to delete the company's internal files unless a ransom was paid. JBS was forced to halt processing operations at over a dozen plants, causing the price of meat to rise and impacting economies across the globe. We've also seen this in our municipalities and schools in Iowa, prompting us in the state legislature to enact legislation addressing ransomware attacks. This particular legislation will help avoid attacks like these by focusing resources to better understand the threat posed by attacks from our foreign adversaries in China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I am proud to support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Iowa yields back. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have no other speakers at this time. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Balance of time. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to stress how important this bill is. We've heard from the speakers on the Republican side, which I certainly agree with everything they've said about the increased ransomware and cyber attacks by foreign actors, bad actors like Beijing and Russia and some of the others that have been mentioned. So it's really important that we pass this bill to protect the United States. And with that, I yield back.